The Veth'kaal had catalogued 4,112 sapient species. None of them drank the thing that killed them. This was not a philosophical observation. It was a data point. The Veth'kaal did not make philosophical observations. They ran models, assigned probabilities, and updated parameters. Across 4,112 species and 11,000 years of xenobiological documentation, not a single sapient organism had voluntarily ingested a substance its own metabolic profile classified as a hepatotoxic agent. Then Dr. Alexei Ivankov stepped through decontamination gate 7 with a dented thermos and changed their oldest model. The gate hissed its final seal behind him. The decontamination cycle had taken 40 minutes, longer than projected, because the station's bioscan had flagged 3 separate compounds on his person as potential contaminants before concluding they were ambient traces from his own biochemistry. His liver, his lungs, the volatile metabolic byproducts of a human being in motion. The Veth'kaal station had never processed an oxygen-metabolizing organism at this throughput, and it had taken its time deciding he wasn't a hazard. He was, in several senses, a hazard, just not the kind their bioscan was designed to catch. Liaison node Veth'kaal met him at the gate's exit corridor, or rather, the node assigned the designation Veth'kaal manifested at the coordinate intersection the station used for new arrival orientation. The Veth'kaal did not meet, in any sense that implied anticipation. They were already everywhere on the station, diffused through the network, and the node standing 2 meters from Ivankov was simply the local density of their attention. It looked, to Ivankov's visual cortex, approximately like a column of amber glass that had decided to have opinions about fluid dynamics. 4 limbs, translucent. The bioluminescent network threading its interior pulsed in patterns he was already trying to categorize and already failing. Dr. Ivankov, it said, through a translator that the station had pre-calibrated using 17 hours of human speech samples. You are the xenobiochemist designated for the joint metabolic study. That's the job. He rolled his shoulder, resettling his kit bag. Any chance you have a coffee service? The pause lasted 0.6 seconds, longer than translation lag. We have not catalogued that requirement in the joint mission parameters. Nobody ever does. He was already unzipping the outer pocket of the kit bag, already extracting the thermos. It was the color of old machinery and bore a dent on the left side that he'd never explained to anyone and never would. He unscrewed the cap. Steam rose, thin and pale in the station's recycled atmosphere. The spectral sensors in the corridor, passive, ambient, always running, took 1.3 seconds to complete their analysis of the vapor plume. Veth'kaal's bioluminescent network shifted frequency. In Veth'kaal processing architecture, this was the equivalent of what a human might call a double take, though the Veth'kaal would not have used that term and did not experience surprise. They processed anomalous data. The anomaly here was this. The vapor rising from the human's container registered as a complex aromatic hydrocarbon compound with established hepatotoxic properties, caffeine alkaloids cross-referenced to class 7 stimulant agents, and pH levels sufficient to cause localized erosion of the station's soft seal corridors if applied directly. The node transmitted the spectral readout to the collective. The collective updated its model of Dr. Alexei Ivankov. He drank. His throat moved. His eyes closed for 1.1 seconds, not a blink, something slower, something that in the Veth'kaal's gesture recognition database flagged as the human expression associated with satisfaction. Then he exhaled. The exhaled breath contained trace ketone bodies in the same aromatic hydrocarbons, now metabolized, the compound broken down, and already being processed by an organ the station's bioscan had flagged as anomalously large for his body mass. The Veth'kaal's probability model generated an output it had never generated in 4,112 species of documentation. The organism had ingested a catalogued toxin. The organism had not died. The organism appeared, by every available metric, to feel better. Probability of survival given voluntary toxin ingestion, previously 0. Model revised. Variable introduced. The variable did not have a name yet. They would need to build one. "I'll need a workspace near the xenochemistry suite," Ivankov said, capping the thermos. "And if you have anything approximating a chair that fits human lumbar geometry, I'd be in your debt." Veth'kaal processed this, added it to the file they were already building. "Follow," it said. He followed. The thermos swung from his left hand. The corridor's passive sensors tracked every step. The report arrived on Ivankov's workstation at 3:40 station time, which the Veth'kaal had apparently decided was a reasonable hour to deliver biochemical findings, because they did not sleep, and had not yet learned that he did. He was, however, awake, had been awake since 200, because the station's atmospheric processors ran at a frequency that his auditory cortex insisted on processing as a very quiet someone humming something almost recognizable. He had given up on sleep at 2:15 and returned to his sample prep. The report was labeled, in translation, Compound Analysis, Ivankov Personal Ingestion Vessel, Health Risk Classification, Tier 3, DELIVERED as Advisory Courtesy. He read it. The Veth'kaal had been thorough. They had identified 22 distinct chemical compounds in his coffee, cross-referenced each against their xenobiological toxicology database, and produced a risk assessment that would have grounded a human research vessel. Hepatotoxic potential, cardiovascular load, adenosine receptor interference classified as neurochemical disruption. The report concluded with a recommendation, stated with the flat precision of a species that did not understand the concept of tact. Immediate cessation of ingestion recommended for continued biological integrity. He laughed. Genuine, involuntary, the kind that starts in the chest before the brain catches up with it. It bounced off the lab's curved walls, and the passive sensors recorded it with the same fidelity they gave everything else. In the collective, the data point joined its accumulating siblings. The xenochemistry session began at 800. He'd been assigned a Veth'kaal lab partner for sample processing, Veth'kaal again, or at least the same node designation, though he was increasingly unsure how much continuity that implied. They were working through atmospheric filtrate samples from the Veth'kaal's home system, compounds native to an environment so chemically rich that the station's outgassing protocols required 3 separate scrubbing cycles before the samples could be stored in the shared lab space. Ivankov held a sealed sample tube up to the light. The liquid inside was the color of old amber. It moved with a viscosity that suggested something between water and regret. "What does it smell like?" he asked. Veth'kaal's network pulsed. "The Veth'kaal do not process chemical compounds through olfactory sensation. We analyze via spectral." "I know how you analyze it." He was still looking at the tube. "I'm asking what it's like." Another pause, longer than translation lag, 1.4 seconds this time. "That question does not parse within our experiential framework." "That's what I thought." He set the tube down, picked up a micropipette. "What's the minimum exposure threshold for adverse effects in an oxygen-metabolizing organism?" The node's bioluminescent network flickered in what he had started to identify as a processing load indicator, the Veth'kaal equivalent of eyes moving while thinking. 0.003 milliliters, aerosolized, would initiate significant bronchial response in. What about 0.001, liquid contact, dermal? A longer pause. Dermal contact at that volume would likely produce localized irritation, possibly systemic if. Right, he was already drawing a microsample. For calibration purposes, I need to know how the compound behaves in contact with organic tissue, and I can't get that from spectral analysis alone. The room stopped functioning. It did not literally stop. The instruments kept running. The atmospheric processors kept humming their almost recognizable frequency. But every Veth'kaal sensor in the lab swiveled toward him in a unified motion that he felt before he saw, a subtle shift in the air pressure of their collective attention. "Dr. Ivankov," said Veth'kaal, "you are proposing voluntary exposure to a compound flagged in your own species' toxicology parameters as a corrosive agent. I'm proposing a microsample." He held the micropipette up. 0.001 milliliters, tongue contact. I'll log the subjective data and you can cross-reference with whatever your sensors capture. This is, the pause, not a translation delay, something that took longer than language. This behavior does not appear in our models for scientific methodology. "It's a very old methodology," he said. "We used to do it with everything." He touched the micropipette to his tongue. The sensation arrived before his brain had fully authorized the experiment, a sudden acute bite, somewhere between battery acid and a very aggressive citrus, followed by a spreading numbness that climbed the left side of his jaw and made his left eye water reflexively. He breathed through it, waited. The numbness peaked at roughly 4 seconds and began its recession. "Sharp," he said, voice slightly thick. "Acidic up front, almost alkaline at the back. The numbness is probably the compound binding to epithelial sodium channels. You'll want to note that the subjective onset was faster than I'd predict from the spectral pH alone. Whatever's in there has a high membrane permeability." He was already writing, left eye still watering. Veth'kaal was still. The whole lab was still in the way that only happened when the collective was processing something it didn't have a category for. An organism that survived voluntary exposure to a flagged corrosive agent, and then generated a first-person account of the neurochemical mechanism of its own tissue damage. The model forked. One branch continued the original trajectory. The other opened a new file, larger than the first, and started filling it. The alarm was a pressure differential event. The station's alert system didn't use sound the way human systems did. It used atmospheric density changes that the Veth'kaal felt as a species-specific signal through their translucent integument. Ivankov felt it as a sudden sense that the room had become slightly more serious. Then the lights shifted frequency. His translator pinged. "Containment breach. XENOCHMISTRY Suite B, atmospheric compound vent. All personnel evacuate Corridor 7 Alpha." He was in Corridor 7 Alpha. He was also, based on the vapor already curling under the lab's secondary door, approximately 6 meters from the breach point. The amber filtrate, the one he'd tasted, the one that needed 3 scrubbing cycles. 2 Veth'kaal nodes had been working in Suite B support staff, not Veth'kaal, running overnight sample processing. He could see them through the lab's observation panel. They were not moving efficiently. Their bioluminescent networks had gone irregular, pulsing in arrhythmic patterns that even he could read as wrong, the Veth'kaal equivalent of a system throwing error codes faster than it could process them. The compound's chemistry didn't interface with human biochemistry as its primary vector. It interfaced with Veth'kaal network chemistry. To the 2 nodes in Suite B, a low-dose atmospheric exposure wasn't a cough and watery eyes. It was a processing cascade. They'd gone partially offline. They were trying to reroute, and the rerouting was failing because the compound was still venting. The manual seal controls for Suite B were at the corridor junction, 6 meters away, directly through the vapor. His respiratory system flagged the atmospheric change before his conscious mind finished the cost-benefit analysis. A reflexive tightening of the bronchial passages, his body running its own numbers and not waiting for authorization. He pulled his collar up over his nose, which was not rated PPE by any meaningful standard, and which he knew was not rated PPE, and walked into the vapor. It hit his eyes first. The same acute bite he'd catalogued from the microsample, now distributed across his corneal surface, his lacrimal ducts firing their maximum response and providing approximately no protection whatsoever. His bronchioles tightened further. He was coughing before he reached the junction, deep, productive coughs that his diaphragm threw up without consultation, and his eyes were streaming to the point where the corridor was more concept than image. He found the seal controls by feel. A panel, a lever, two sequential locks that he had reviewed in the station's emergency orientation, because he reviewed emergency orientations in new facilities, not because he had expected to need them, but because the overlap between things I might need and things I didn't expect had proven over the course of his career to be very large. The lever required a physical force that Veth'kaal architecture had calibrated for Veth'kaal limb mechanics. He generated more force. The lever moved. The sequential locks cycled. The vent dampers engaged. The vapor density in the corridor began dropping. He stood at the junction for a moment, coughing, eyes producing more fluid than seemed structurally justified, and waited for his airways to reach an accommodation with the residual compound in his system. It took 31 seconds. He counted. Then he walked back to the lab, sat down on the bench and opened his thermos. The coffee was still hot. He drank. Veth'kaal had materialized in the lab doorway. The node must have been rerouted here from elsewhere on the station, the collective repositioning its local attention to where events were occurring. Its network was running at full luminosity. In the time Ivankov had been in the corridor, every sensor the station possessed had been focused on him, and the data those sensors had produced was still being integrated. An oxygen-metabolizing organism had walked, voluntarily and without rated PPE, into an atmospheric compound that had incapacitated two Veth'kaal nodes. The organism had sealed the breach. The organism was now drinking its hepatotoxin. "The two nodes in Suite B," Ivankov said, voice still slightly rough. "Are they going to be all right?" The collective processed the question, processed the fact that this was the first thing the human had said. "They are rerouting through adjacent network pathways. Full processing capacity will be restored within 2.4 hours. He nodded, drank again. "The compound," he said, "doesn't interact with my biochemistry through the same vector it uses on yours. Whatever it's doing to your network chemistry, my nervous system isn't structured to receive that signal. For me, it's just—" He paused. His left eye was still slightly bloodshot. "A bad Tuesday." Veth'kaal's network pulsed. "You were aware that the compound's primary hazard vector was non-applicable to your biology." "I guessed." He held the thermos up, looking at it. "Good thing one of us has a liver." The node processed this, cross-referenced the statement against its translation database. The word liver retrieved its anatomical data, hepatic organ, oxygen metabolizer, metabolic processing. The phrase "good thing one of us" has cross-referenced as a comparison statement implying the speaker possessed something the other party lacked. The Veth'kaal did not have livers. They did not have individual organs of any kind. This was accurate. The humor was not accessible from any available angle. But the data was. The data was very clear. And the model they were building for Dr. Alexei Ivankov was growing faster than any model they had built in 4,112 species of documentation. The variable they had not yet named was accumulating values. At 1100 station time, Veth'kaal presented Ivankov with a document. This was unusual. The Veth'kaal did not typically produce documents for human review. They transmitted data to his workstation, flagged relevant fields, expected him to extract what he needed. A formal presentation implied something the collective had decided required a formal context. He took the document. It was a probability chain, the longest single-organism behavioral prediction model the station systems had ever generated. He could see that from the metadata alone. 11 pages. each page a cascade of conditional probabilities branching from a central spine that began with the moment he'd stepped through decontamination gate 7. He read it. It took 9 minutes. At the end of 9 minutes, he looked up at Kethsevel's node and laughed, the same involuntary chest-first kind as before, though quieter this time, shaped by something adjacent to being seen clearly for the first time in a while. The model predicted, with 94.7% confidence, that within 72 hours he would voluntarily ingest, apply to his skin, or otherwise expose himself to at least one additional compound on the station that would cause measurable biological harm. This was not a threat assessment. It was pattern recognition. He had tasted the amber filtrate. He had walked into a vapor cloud without rated PPE. He had, on his first day, drank from a thermos that the station's spectral sensors had flagged as a Tier 3 hepatotoxic agent. The model had extrapolated. It was not wrong. He knew it was not wrong. That was the part that was funny. Attached to the probability chain was a secondary document, a list of 14 compounds currently present on the station, each classified by its specific hazard vector for oxygen metabolizing biology, each accompanied by a recommended avoidance protocol. The Veth'kaal had produced this list in the 6 hours since the Suite B breach. They had cross-referenced it against his movement logs, his research schedule, and the likely locations he would access during the remainder of the joint mission. They had, in their precise mechanical way, tried to protect him. He photographed the list with his workstation's imaging suite, filed it. Kethsevel's network pulsed, the processing load flicker, sustained this time. "You have archived the document," the node said. "For reference." Another sustained pulse. "The document specifies compounds you are to avoid. A reference document implies repeated consultation. The avoidance of a compound should require no repeated consultation. The avoidance decision is binary and requires only one execution." He looked at the node, the amber light of its bioluminescent network, the way the patterns moved in its interior with a regularity that was very precise and very fast, and had nothing behind it that he could reach. "Compound 7, he said, "the fluorinated silicate suspension. Dermal exposure would cause." "I know what it would cause. I read the file." He set the document down. "I filed it for reference because I want to know where all 14 of them are when I'm working." The pause this time lasted 0.3 seconds. In a distributed network capable of processing at the speeds the Veth'kaal operated, 0.3 seconds was not a translation delay. It was not a computational bottleneck. It was the processing time required when the model ran a conditional probability and returned a value it had not predicted. "You have memorized the locations," Kethsevel said, "of the compounds we have identified as hazardous to your biology." "Orientation habit," he said. "New facility. I like to know where the edges are, so that you may avoid them." He picked up his thermos, looked at it for a moment, the dent on the left side, the scratched surface, the object's history written in its damage which he had never explained to anyone. "So that I know where they are," he said. He looked up at Kethsevel, the node, the local density of a vast distributed intelligence that had catalogued 4,112 species and had, until 32 hours ago, believed its models were comprehensive. "You've never wondered what anything tastes like, have you?" The pause. 0.3 seconds, an eternity in network time. Long enough to run the probability chain forward and backward, and find that neither direction produced an output the collective was prepared for. "No," said Kethsevel. He nodded, slow, the nod of a man recognizing something he suspected for a long time. He didn't explain. There was nothing to explain that the explanation would help. Either you were the kind of thing that wondered, or you weren't, and the gap between those two categories was wider than any chemistry he'd been hired to study. He refilled the thermos from the heating unit he'd requisitioned on day 1. capped it. Veth'kaal returned to its network. The collective processed. The model, the longest, most complex, most heavily branched single-organism behavioral prediction in 4,112 species of documentation, was updated one more time. They had to invent a new variable for the update. Their existing notation didn't have a symbol for it. The closest they could construct was a compound expression, the weighted probability mass assigned to behaviors generated by an organism that calculated the value of an experience as exceeding the cost of the harm that experience caused. They built the symbol, added it to the model, updated the priors. The symbol had no natural language translation in the Veth'kaal's communication system. They would need to generate one if they ever needed to explain it to another species. The human already had a word for it. He used it every morning in the first quiet seconds after the coffee hit his blood, when the compound their best models classified as a slow-acting toxin did the thing their best models still could not predict, made him, against all probability, feel more alive.